right, welcome back. I hope you had a good break. I'm very excited about all of our panels, but I'm very excited about this particular panel as well on modern heresies about women. As has been mentioned a couple of times, there are distorted narratives about women coming from different sectors of our culture, both within and outside the church. So we're going to dig into some of these, what we're calling heresies. Some of them are in this panel. And we have a lineup of brilliant women here. Our first speaker will be Leah Libresco Sargeant, who is the author of multiple books, including Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Option. She works in family policy in Washington, D.C., and her writing has appeared in a number of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Plow, First Things, and other outlets. She runs a great Substack called Other Feminisms, which you should check out if you're not familiar with it. Her Substack community focuses on advocating for women as women in a world that treats them as defective men. That's kind of the subject of her forthcoming book, The Dignity of Dependence, which will be coming out from University of Notre Dame Press in October, but one lucky person here could get an advanced copy. If you want to enter this QR code here, you can enter a raffle to get an advanced copy of Leah's new book. You can get these and look at the one advanced copy we have at the Notre Dame press table outside. And then we also have with us Erika Bachiochi, who I need to find her bio. There it is. Okay. Erika Bachiochi, who is a legal scholar working at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, women's history, and Catholic social teaching. She's the author of the acclaimed 2021 book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision. Also highly recommend that book if you haven't yet read it. She's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and also the editor-in-chief of Fairer Disputations, which is a relatively new online journal of sex realist feminism. She's also a 2024-25 fellow at the Nesty Center for Faith and Culture at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where she's teaching in the new Catholic Women and Gender Studies program, which you should also be aware of if you haven't heard of that new program down at the University of St. Thomas. She is the happily married mother of 7 children, several of whom are here, I think, ranging ages 23 down to 6. She also has a forthcoming book, which is currently under review with Yale University Press, called Women in the Image of God. So very much looking forward to that as well. We also have Angela Franks, who previously spoke with us this morning, who's awesome, but I already read her bio, so I'm not going to do it again. Because it's long, because she's done so much. And we also have Professor Rachel M. Coleman here, who is Assistant Professor of Theology at Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts. And in addition to her Ph.D. in theology, she holds a B.S. in biology and a B.A. in philosophy. And she writes most often about metaphysics. All right, so we're going to have Leah kick things off. We're going to start, just give you a little format here. We're going to start by having each panelist give about a 7-8 minute opening kind of initial remarks about a particular heresy they want to point out. And then we'll move into maybe 20 to 30 minute portion of a moderated discussion while I'll ask some questions of the panelists. They might have questions of each other, so we'll just see some panelist interaction. And then for the last half hour, we're going to open it up totally to open discussion and Q&A with the audience. So there'll be plenty of time for questions and interaction from you all, so don't let me down. Okay, I'm sure there'll be lots of things that we can talk about. All right, so Leah, why don't you kick us off? You're welcome. Oh, by the way, you guys are welcome to either come up to the podium or just speak at the table. It's up to you.
I'll just speak at the table so I don't force you all to go to the podium to match. I do want to start by just saying thank you for having me, and I want to offer a big thank you to Notre Dame and the McGrath Institute because, as some of you have seen, I'm juggling a baby while I'm here, who is mostly being babysat during both panels and morning naps by volunteers from the Pro-Life Club, which I'm very grateful for, and it's been a real source of witness just even as I've been flying here. When people say, you're taking a baby to a work conference? And for me to be able to say, not only am I taking him, but he's being welcomed by people because of their pro-life commitment. And a thank you to you all, because when for a moment I couldn't find the babysitter for this panel, my plan was for him to crowd surf, and many of you had already made it clear that was acceptable, so thank you. The heresy I want to tackle is one of, I think, a suite of heresies that are all founded in that problem of Aristotelianism, of taking women as somehow, in some form, defective men. And these heresies are differentiated mostly by which particular defect makes us women rather than men. And the one I'm most interested in is the definition of women as the weaker sense, parentheses, pejorative. Because I think it's important to be able to give a firm, positive articulation of what it means to be women and what God did in creating us, not to feel boxed into denying there is any form of weakness that we participate in, or any form of weakness that marks us out as different from men. Certainly, you can draw the overlapping bell curves of how tall men and women are and say, well, there are some women who are very tall, but many men are taller. You can draw the much further apart overlapping bell curves of grip strength. And this is my most interesting one, because I think people attach the lowest moral value to grip strength, offhand. And yet, this is one of the ones where the bell curves are the furthest apart, where 95% of men are stronger than all but 5% of women. There's a large gap. We're much closer together in how tall we are than we are in grip strength. And yet, seldom does a woman wake up and go, if I don't have the grip strength of a median man, of what value am I? And then there are the forms of weakness that I think, don't admit of those overlapping bell curves at all, that are about women's exposure to physical weakness for the sake of another through pregnancy. Something men do not and cannot participate in, that no bell curve kind of puts us on even the same spectrum of. And what I really want to do in calling out this heresy as a heresy is I'm going after the parentheses pejorative part, not the weaker part. Because what I think we see is too often, when we don't trust that men and women can be different without that being an attack on our equality in dignity, then there are kind of two different temptations. One is simply to deny the facts when there is a real difference, to try and deny that fact has any weight. This is easier for grip strength, I think. I think we all don't even bother saying, well, surely if we line people up, we could disprove those bell curves. We don't care. We move past it. But then there's the temptation to say, all right, well, if I can't deny a difference, I've got to find a way to make that difference not count practically. And that's where I think pregnancy and fertility poses the strongest challenge. If you are afraid, either as a man or a woman, that if men and women aren't interchangeable, they cannot have equal dignity, pregnancy poses a severe threat. And then there's either the temptation to say, well, look, pregnancy doesn't have to slow a woman down. A woman can do anything pregnant and backwards in high heels, and I'll prove it to you. Which, since that's not true, puts women and babies at severe risk of working through working conditions that do not suit her or her baby's needs, of returning to work too early if her equality is premised on the idea that pregnancy in no way makes her different from a man. She's a little larger in front, but otherwise basically the same. And if it were any other way, she wouldn't count, wouldn't be employable, wouldn't be fully human. Or you face the other solution, which is, okay, pregnancy does make women meaningfully different than men. It does make them weaker, more vulnerable to the needs of someone else. So the problem here, the villain here, is the baby. The baby is doing something bad to the woman. Insofar as a baby slows a woman down, the baby is an assault on her humanity. Because if a woman isn't identical and interchangeable and strong in each way, equivalently strong to a man, then we don't have a way to protect her equally under the law. We don't have a way to treat her equally in society. And there we see, going back to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that she thought the preferred logic for the access to abortion was not a matter of privacy, because it wasn't really about how private is this decision. She thought it was about equal protection under the law. That if women didn't have the same ability to cut themselves loose from someone who depended on them, the same ability a man does by walking away, then the law should afford her that ability. It couldn't be a matter of simple cowardice of walking out. It would have to involve a weapon, because the ties were too intimate to be avoided without being violently severed. But there you have, again, stemming from that impulse, that if the woman is in any way the weaker sex, that's a bad thing about a woman, and radical means are justified to free her from that weakness. Then you might say, is this a heresy per se? Is this just an error about biology or ethics? What makes this a heresy? And I want to go back to that sense of the weaker sex, that comparative, weaker than whom? What I think makes this a heresy and not just a moral or descriptive error is you can only come up with this idea that weakness and dependence is pejorative, does cast women out of the range of fully being human, in the same way the logic of abortion casts babies in the womb out of being fully human because they're dependent, in the same way the logic of euthanasia casts the elderly as out of being fully human because they depend on others. If you start from a wrong idea of who we are in relationship to God. And that's what makes us a heresy. And here I'd like to quote directly from St. John Henry Newman, who wrote of both men and women that it's a basic error to think that we are independent beings. And what he wrote is, independence was not made for man, that it is an unnatural state that may do for a while, but will not carry us safely on to the end. We are creatures, and being such have two duties: to be resigned and to be thankful. And so you come back to this question of women as the weaker sex. What it really obscures is that men and women are actually on the overall grand scheme overlapping bell curves very close together on weakness, when you remember that there is this other part of the number line all the way out at infinity, which is God. And that if women despise ourselves for certain forms of weakness, from everything from grip strength to fertility, and if men despise us for those reasons, if men think of themselves as simply the stronger sex, unmarked by weakness, unlike women who sometimes, embarrassingly, can't escape it, then neither men nor women know how to love themselves and love God's work in them as dependent creatures. Each of us begins our life in an age of profound dependence in the womb. Most of us end our lives, if we're lucky, unless we're hit by a bus in the prime of life, in a state of profound dependence on others. And each of those times of dependence, of being the weaker one, whether we're weaker than someone of the other sex, someone of a different age, our own mother, is training for knowing how we can be lovable to God, who excels us in all things. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Leah. Thank you so much. The heresy I'm going to talk about is the idea of fertility or the female reproductive system as a kind of illness or defect. So it's going to jump off on what she was sharing. I first got into researching things in an extensive way on women's history bioethics when I wrote a book co-concurrent with my dissertation, which was not on history, so I don't recommend that, on Margaret Sanger and her connection to the eugenics movement. And what was very clear, why Sanger was so influential and really revolutionary, is that she was really the first person to clearly and consistently say, from this kind of supposedly feminist perspective, that what oppresses women is her fertility. Like, fertility is the thing that oppresses us. And it's become so much part of the air we breathe that, it's just understood that, if you want women to be equal and free, well, they have to have, quote unquote, reproductive rights, which mean actually anti-reproductive rights, but that's that's Sanger's insight, right? That the thing that holds women back is the fact that she's fertile. And it's interesting because at the time Sanger was writing, so she's first proposing this kind of thing in the 19-teens and 20s. There's a robust opposing kind of feminist perspective, many perspectives, in fact, but most of those perspectives were arguing that what oppressed women were social structures, lack of education, inability to hold property, so forth. So, in other words, things outside women that we could address through legal or political or social action. What Sanger did was to say, no, the thing that oppresses women is inside her. And so what this introduces is an alienation within the woman herself, right? Where it's like, yeah, like I'm encountering problems, but what's the real problem? Me. And not only me, it's my healthy body that's the problem. And so that message, I think, has been really deleterious to women, because it's, women are already inclined to view themselves as problems, or to like want to tinker with their bodies or their selves or whatever to make things better. And so there's no way that you can have real female integration when your message is that your problem is your healthy human body. What this really is presupposing, in fact, is that the model of human health and freedom is the man, right? And so this is kind of woman as a defective man on steroids, right? Because it's like, well, how do you become, like, it's going along with this assumption that woman can simply become the man somehow, but how? Well, you have to attack your healthy body. Right? Like, and if you do that, if you repress that, then you're just basically the man. So it's kind of like this weird, odd Aristotelian, like, modern Aristotelian perversion, which Aristotle would find very strange, by the way. And so one of the problems, there's a lot of things to critique in this idea. One of the problems is it just doesn't work, and that's why I appreciate Erika's reproductive asymmetry idea so much, because the premise that Sanger had, and that, so she founded Planned Parenthood, which, has the most abortion clinics in the US, probably in the world, and the premise is, well, how do we get rid of the problem that's fertility? The premise is technology is going to solve this for us, right? And so we have, in Sanger's day, she had the diaphragm, which was kind of comic, like all the things she would say about claims she would make about the diaphragm. But she also put lots and lots of money, or found people to put money, into the development of the birth control pill and into the development of the IUD. And both of these were designed, in fact, to be able to be used in, I forget the exact phrase, that kind of delicate euphemism of like, unwilling populations, but basically uneducated women who, the IUDs are very cheap, at least the ones that they were distributing in the population control campaigns. They were like, you get a woman in, you put the IUD in, and there's actually in documents that you can track down, because I did, from Planned Parenthood and Population Council. They're like, what we really hope is that she forgets that it's even there. And she'll just be like, wow, it's weird. I haven't gotten pregnant in like forever. I wonder why. But like, she'll just forget it's there. And if she changes her mind, how does she get it out? She has to find a doctor who's willing to take it out, right? So the IUD was in many ways like the best example of like long-term acting doctor-dependent birth control, but like premised on this idea that we just get that kind of birth control in a woman, and now she can just be like a man. And it's just refusing to acknowledge that it's changing one's womanhood, changing one's fertility is not actually possible technologically. And so it's one reason why abortion use, at least among adolescents, skyrockets precisely when they are using contraception. The more contraceptive education and use they have, the higher the abortion rate is, because it fails, especially if you're an adolescent, by the way. Like the data is terrible on that kind of compliance. So it sets up a paradigm that's not going to work, right? That we have this disability that keeps us from being men, and we will fix it through technology. And nothing in those statements are correct. Just quickly, like that's sort of like the left-wing side of things. Kind of from the right-wing side, you get a related heresy, which is that natural family planning is somehow a bad thing because it like interferes with women's fertility, right? And that it's just contraception. It's just kind of like the Catholic contraception, and so you have to say no to it. What contraception does is much different from what NFP does, because NFP is not a technological workaround of your fertility. NFP technical theological name is periodic continence. You are periodically choosing not to have sex, which we all do, by the way, right? We're doing it right now, so it's okay. Right? There's nothing wrong with, like, periodically, even within a marriage, choosing to refrain from sex. But like that's it's considered a vice, right? To make that decision to not engage in sexual activity. I mean, Paul even says you can, if you agree as a couple, you can separate yourself for a time, right? So it's a much different way of thinking about the human person than the contraceptive abortion mindset. So with that, I'll pass it on to Rachel.
So I just want to say thanks to Abby and Notre Dame and the McGrath Institute. Most of the conferences I attend, the sex ratio is exactly the opposite of this, so this is very refreshing for me. Okay, so being a woman who studies theology and who now I guess could be called a theologian, I've often been asked if I want to be a priest. Early on in my graduate studies, when I was met with this question, I would respond with perplexity and stutter out something along the lines of, no, I'm Catholic. And then my interlocutor would generally come back either with, well, that doesn't matter, or, oh, so you want to be a nun? And either way, my bewilderment would continue, and I'd try to escape the conversation as quickly as possible. I still get the question, but my response has changed. First, I tend to laugh, and then I tend to say, no, that sounds awful. And then I laugh some more. And now it's the question asker who looks at me with perplexity. And when I then ask that person why he thinks I should want to be a priest, it is he who tries to escape the conversation as quickly as possible. It's a modern heresy that women need to be priests in order to have equal status in the church. Neither the Catholic nor the Orthodox, fortunately, have fallen to this heresy, though I guess it is the case that those denominations that have all fell to other heresies first. Still, we should note the strength and grace it has taken for the church not to fall prey to this heresy, given that it is almost taken for granted everywhere else. In order for women truly to be equal, they need to be able to be priests. And its corollary, women are not equal in the Catholic Church. The reason I respond the way I do to people who ask me if I want to be a priest is because it is, frankly, offensive on several different levels. First, that the only reason anyone would want to study theology is in order to be a priest. That's offensive because it presumes theology is really only the realm of priests. In fact, I wish more priests would make theology more of their realm, but that's a discussion for another day. Second, the sentiment is deeply clericalist. It presumes that for anyone to be a real member of the church, or perhaps a full participant thereof, that person must be a priest. This is patently false and misunderstands the nature of both the church and the priesthood. The Petrine office exists for the sake of the church, not the other way around. Third, and probably most offensive, if also most hidden, such a question presumes that I need to be the same as a man in order to be equal to him. Another way to say this, equality necessitates sameness, or also that same means equality, which I'm not sure is true. This is, I suspect, at the root of the heresies we're addressing on this panel, but let me try to address it with respect to this specific case of women not being equal to men in the church because they can't be priests. Why aren't women able to be priests? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but let's just start with Scripture. Jesus ordained no women. And let me address a silly, if common, objection to this right now, that Jesus did not ordain women because this would have been too far outside the social mores of his time. The Lord broke every more possible, so much so that he was crucified for it. But this is the one time he followed social convention. The mind boggles. The objection doesn't even make much sense historically. Even if Jews did not allow priestesses, the broader pagan culture would absolutely have been familiar with them. With that set aside, we can take our Lord's actions as we should, as revealing something about both God's nature and human nature. Rather than thinking the Lord made a mistake, the hubris, we should perhaps take a moment to reflect on why he didn't ordain women and what this reveals about the nature of reality. It does not mean, I must first say, that women are less than men or somehow do not have equal status to men in the church. Again, the Lord's actions bear this out. He spends time with women, speaks to women that, according to social convention, he shouldn't, defends women, and perhaps most importantly, took his literal flesh from a woman. It was women and not most of the men he ordained who stayed with him to the end, and it was women who knew and first spread the good news. The Lord's not ordaining women is thus not a declaration of women's lower status. And if it is not that, then it must reveal that men and women are different and thus have different capacities while still being equal. That, of course, is a truth we've been trying to make sense of since the garden, and thus I won't be able to resolve or explain it all here, so let me have recourse to the theologian Louis Bouillet, who wrote the criminally underknown Women in the Church. Bouillet writes that the, quote, call for the ordination of women in order to assure the equality of women and men supposes that this equality cannot be obtained except by as radical an effacement as possible of the difference between them. But following this path of equalization, what people who call for this want to promote risks being ruined from the outset because the problem is posed, without their realizing it, in unrealistic, self-defeating terms. The apparent victory they would win in such circumstances, far from assuring them their heart's desire, would be veiled in its defeat. We find ourselves in this case, he continues, in the presence of a form of feminism which, well-intentioned as it might be, can only be destructive of the true liberation of women. For equality which is confused with pure and simple identity with another could not possibly be anything but delusion. It could only result for those who insist upon it in the final loss of their own identity, end quote. Equality or equal status is not bestowed on me by trying to make me into something that I'm not, that is, a man. Rather, one recognizes my equality by embracing what I am and what I am given to be, that is, a woman. The Lord clearly did not think the priesthood for women, but he did seem to think a woman was worthy to take his flesh from, and a woman was worthy to become the mother of all, as the church. And it was, after all, a woman and not a man who was able to say, "Let it be done unto me according to thy word." The heresy that attempts to assert that women are not equal unless they can be priests also then implicitly states that all of these things that I just mentioned that are unique to a woman are not actually important, that they are somehow not equal to a man's contribution. And to that I say, anathema sit.
So Abby, you're brilliant for bringing these brilliant women together, and I am totally at a loss for having to go after them all, especially all the humor. It's been so funny. But of course, my topic is itself totally humorous, and that is that my heresy is red pill Catholicism, which is all over the internet. And so, we could just point out people like Andrew Tate and Pearl Davis, who are taking up a lot of space on the internet and talking about how women are unequal and marriage is horrible and all that. But there's sort of this sliver of these men within Catholicism who call themselves Orthodox Catholics, think of themselves as Orthodox Catholics. Nick Fuentes, I think that's his name, Tim Gordon, and kind of Gordon's guys, who make claims like that Tate is 90% right about everything having to do with women. And so I want to talk about those Catholics, because, you can go listen to, actually, Lila Rose has a good takedown of Andrew Tate and everything that he's been doing, but we're really concerned with what these Catholic guys are saying. So the basic heretical claim that someone like Tim Gordon, who some of you may have seen, I kind of called out in the Wall Street Journal, I guess a week ago or 2 weeks ago or at some point, is that the male sex is the superior sex. The male sex images God more perfectly. Yes, he says women, of course, as human beings, have intellect and will, but to a much lesser degree than men. And so And here he's, basically looking at Aristotelianism, but also Thomas Aquinas and other fathers of the church. And that's kind of the problem with him, is that he's actually quoting from particular documents and particular fathers, that women are natural subjects, as we saw the text that we saw on the screen, and therefore need men to rule them. And women cannot lead and cannot teach except their children, thus, the papal bull against Teresa of Avila. So this is like parts of our tradition, so it's kind of messy, right? And as such, the claim here is that really women only need the traditionally feminine virtues that are obedience, like the virtues of obedience, docility, submission, subjection, silence, and men need the virtues of rule, which are basically like the cardinal virtues of rule. So courage, justice, those. And importantly, he thinks this lesser reason, their lesser reason, women's incapacity for reason, or at least lesser reason, their lesser status, their lesser rank, explains several things about Catholic teaching, or about the Bible as well. So the fact that in Genesis 3, the story of the fall, when Eve is told, your husband will rule over you, that's because of her lesser reason. The fact that Christ assumed a male body is because women are inferior to men. And I haven't heard him say this, but I assume he would think because women can't be priests because they are inferior to men. And also why Paul in Ephesians 5 indicates that women ought to submit to or obey their husbands because they are inferior to men. And so as one who has read actually a lot of radical feminist literature in my day, this is actually exactly what they claim that the church says, and how they read these passages. And in fact, he applauds Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who late in her life felt the need she had to rewrite the Bible. She wrote the Woman's Bible because she understood, this is Gordon saying, that the Bible views women as the inferior sex. Now, it doesn't quite matter to him, because he probably doesn't know, that Elizabeth Cady Stanton late in her life was basically ostracized by the 19th century women's movement for this fact, and a couple other things as well, because they were relying, as I'll talk at great length about on Friday morning, they were relying on the Bible, on Genesis, on the Imago Dei for their claims, for their rights claims. So there's of course a danger in bringing attention to him, as again I did in the Wall Street Journal, because his views are fringe. Anyone who basically is formed well as a Catholic and knows Catholic teaching today thinks they're ridiculous. But the problem is, as you may have heard, that there's there's kind of some Catholic interests, like on the right, the political right, there's kind of conversions, there's a lot of people like interested in, coming to Rome. And they're getting a lot of their information on the internet. So when you go to your parish and you ask, do you know Tim Gordon? Well, no, of course not. But if you go and read YouTube comment sections, like me on Lila Rose recently talking about feminism and submission and marriage, go read the comment section. It's all Tim Gordon type claims. And I actually have a personal example of this. My son is 18, really devout Catholic, and has been kind of trying to help a friend of his along who's brilliant. They go to boys' school. Brilliant boy who actually converted, I think partly because of my son's prayers and all that, to Catholicism, but has been totally red-pilled. And so my son sent him this column I'd written, has been wanting to send him things, and he immediately came back with Aquinas, his commentary on 1 Timothy. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on that, because that's actually what Gordon's doing, is he's quoting a lot from Aquinas. And Aquinas is the angelic doctor. All of us here on this panel, and I suspect lots of people out there, I know many who've done PhDs on Aquinas, and he is the angelic doctor and ought to be really looked at first. And a lot of my work in law is around sort of recovering his account of law. But he's not the magisterium. And even Aquinas can get a couple things wrong. Like the Immaculate Conception, yeah. And so it's important to understand that really Gordon's chief error, as much as he thinks he loves the church, and I think he does love what he thinks is the church and all that, is that he is lacking in obedience. And he is lacking adherence of the church's teachings on women as they've developed in the modern church over the last 100 years or so, as we heard Angela recount really well. So I just want to get a little bit into Aquinas on 1 Timothy, and you can, of course, read him on women generally, because I think it's a really important, so Thomas Aquinas is kind of an incredible genius of a mind, a holy man, I think, obviously, who was synthesizing, right? Synthesizing all these sources, right? Scripture, the church fathers, Augustine, right? And Aristotle. And for bringing in Aristotle, it really helped him to make enormous progress in so many areas on ethics, politics, et cetera, in metaphysics too, I think. And so I'm now going to quote from Aquinas, and this is something that we hear in Gordon and Gordon-like people, because they're like throwing it into the chats, and the young men are hearing this, and young women too, and there's a lot of confusion, I think. So this is Aquinas now. So in 1 Timothy, now I'm not a Bible scholar, but from what I understand and just reading the commentary and all that, is that Timothy, so Paul is writing a letter to Timothy talking about kind of ecclesial matters. And so we get down a lot of things about priests and bishop and kind of ordering of ecclesiology, the early ecclesiology, obviously. And then we get down sort of women's roles in the church, but then also in their own homes. And so Aquinas is very clear, like looking at the scripture, and then he is calling upon the philosopher, Aristotle, to help him interpret the scripture. So whereas we saw that John Paul II is looking at Genesis to help him interpret the rest of the scripture, right? The Imago Dei in Genesis to help him understand other scripture. Aquinas goes right to his beloved Aristotle. And Aristotle is also beloved to me, but also got this thing wrong. And so Aquinas says, since it is natural for women to be softer in body than men, so too are they weaker in reason. He says silence, again, our beloved Aquinas, silence, discipline, and subjection are three things suitable for women, which proceed from one source, their lack of reason. Thomas Aquinas also reads Genesis 3, he shall rule over you, the fall, right? As expressly through Aristotle. He says men rule women as the soul rules the body, since it's natural for one with more reason to rule and give orders, and the other to be subject because, again, lacking in reason. And so what's the kind of, the flower, I think the beautiful development of doctrine, right? Is this reading, again, of the Imago Dei and understanding that both are made in the image of God, and so both men and women image God fully, and that both enjoy, of course, the full capacity of intellect and will, and so full capacities for rational and moral judgment. And this is really important, that they're both rational and responsible. And so woman's end is like man's, heaven, friendship with God, which Aquinas well recognized. He did think there was an equality with regard to heaven and sanctity for sure. But with regard to reason, that means that with regard to acquisition and cultivation of virtue, which has a lot to do with, the reason properly ordering our passions, he didn't think that was as possible for women. And so the important point, too, is that it's not just John Paul II who is correcting this. We saw Vatican II, of course, and then after, of course, Benedict, who in his letter to bishops a beautiful letter on the collaboration of women and men in, I think, 2006, he talks about woman as helpmate, as not about in being inferior, but as a vital helper, right? We saw that in the nice kind of interpretations and translations of the Hebrew. But importantly, I think it's really important that we see, and that I wish Gordon would see, that the modern church does not reject Aristotelian or Thomist understandings and within the tradition because of this error in practical judgment about this one particular thing. In fact, if you take that little thorn out or take the cancer out or take whatever you want to say, that judgment about women, and you take it out, it all can heal and in fact really help us to understand. As Angela pointed out, someone like Christina Pizan is using Aristotle against Aristotle. I, in fact, use Thomas Aquinas against Thomas Aquinas sometimes with regard to law and women. And so that heals. And then we have all these scholars right now doing this kind of incredible work. People at this table, in fact, these two theologians to my right, to your left, who are doing really important work within sort of the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. I'm also doing the same in law, who are sort of correcting Thomas on that point. Don't see that point as damning him in any way, but just correcting that point, understanding development of doctrine. And there's others too who are doing really good work. Tim Fortin is in fact one of them. So I guess I'll just end. I wanna say, just quote John Henry Newman and Augustine, because I think it's important to see where in the tradition. So it's not as though John Paul II and Benedict, like throw rocks at Thomas Aquinas on this, and like the rest of the tradition has been with Aquinas. Well, that's not true either. In fact, Augustine was quite good on women, and quite good, I think, having understanding. Prudence Allen thinks, I think you might have mentioned that he spent more time with women. We don't want to get into how he was spending time with women. But obviously he had a really incredible mother and all that. And Thomas Aquinas was literally like sequestered himself, but then, anyway, so not a lot of women around. But this is just Augustine talking about Genesis 1. So let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every creepy thing which creepeth on the earth. That's, of course, him quoting. And then he says, he did not intend his rational creature made in his own image should have lordship over any, but irrational creatures, not man over man, but man over beasts. And so you understand, like, he's seeing the common dominion that woman and man have over creation. And I also want to quote Newman, who of course has already been quoted, because he's really good on Genesis 3. And again, this really precedes John Paul II, as I'll talk about on Friday. There's also some really good mid-19th century women's rights advocates who got this really early too. But Newman says that Genesis 3, he will rule over you, has been strikingly fulfilled. Man has strength to conquer the thorns and thistles which the earth is cursed with, but the same strength has ever proven the fulfillment of the punishment to the woman. The weaker half of mankind has been tyrannized and debased by strong arms of force. The final thing I'll just say is that I think that Tim Gordon gives his whole kind of position away when he says, and he's kind of wrestling with it, he says, it would be unjust for women to absolutely subject herself to their husbands, right? For wives to absolutely subject themselves to their husbands if females were not the inferior sex. And so I just say, well, females aren't the inferior sex, and therefore it is unjust for that to have that full subjection. That's all. Thanks. Oh, good.
All right, thank you all so much. There's so many places we could go with this. So one of the things that makes heresies particularly destructive is that there's always a hidden truth. Right? That's what makes them powerful. That's what makes them sticky. So where do you see perhaps some hidden truths that are present but being distorted in some of the heresies that we've discussed? Should we just jump in?
Sure, I mean, just quickly, the reproduction is more burdensome to women. I mean, it just is. It demands more of her. There's no doubt about it. And so the question is, do we address that by eliminating female reproduction, or do we address that by putting more supports around women, beginning with her family, but then also in the wider communities?
And I'll jump in right after you since ours complement each other. I think this is right, that most of the time, a heresy speaks to a partial truth that includes a higher truth. And that can make it hard to pry people away from an error because they find something that's really compelling. And you're not always, sometimes you're trying to get them to give it up entirely, but sometimes to place it in the context of a larger truth. Like a lot of our heresies about Christ involve taking part of who he is. Well, he's God, so how could he be man? And then not understanding how to hold those truths together. And I think when it comes to female reproduction and the weight it places on people, a lot of the things that are true are both it is burdensome, and then how do we respond to that? And I think it's really a challenge of discernment. I look around this room here, and I see people responding to a range of bodily weaknesses, with tools or accommodations. I see a lot of glasses. I'm the only one not wearing them on this panel, I noticed. Yeah, contacts. I saw, some mobility devices. I heard a breast pump during an earlier event. I'm not calling out whose. And I think we face that challenge of when we find that in some ways our bodies are making it difficult to do something, when do we find tools or modify our bodies? And when do we say this weakness or even this suffering is the thing God is calling me towards? And I'm not saying that everyone needs to throw down their glasses and squint, right? But I think we both want to make real room for accommodation, for more support for women with the burdens of pregnancy, and to say, but there are burdens of pregnancy that no amount of support can solve. And therefore, a fully truthful and a fully Catholic response is not just a response about what is owed in justice to the woman, which is part of the response, but about suffering with, which is a different kind of solution that we look for to the secular world. And that sense of, well, is there some gap we can't fully bridge with technology? The answer is yes. And there are also gaps of grief that we can't fully bridge or fix with medicine. And I think only the Catholic Church speaks well into how to suffer with and find fruit in suffering. And the secular world provides a lot of useful tools, right? But they need to be applied alongside a knowledge that there will always come a time when our tools and accommodations do fail, and we need to find something beautiful in the suffering body.
So just to go back to one of the points that I made about equality and sameness, I think I think we have a real issue with difference, like just in general. And I think that goes back to the question of justice. And this might be the sort of like half-truth that because if the heresy is that equality equals sameness or that sameness equals equality, then it seems to me the half-truth is that like everyone deserves like to be treated justly, essentially. And the only way we can figure that out is to like treat everyone the same. But that's precisely not treating everyone justly. Like as the quote from Bouyer that I read earlier states, like in treating everyone the same, you're actually accomplishing the exact opposite of justice. So I think the half-truth is treating everyone justly, like everyone does deserve justice, but then we then immediately translate that into, then that means we treat everybody the same. And then to continue your, on the heresy track, the church's response to heresy has always been, like from the beginning, Chesterton says that that doctrine doesn't close the mystery, it keeps it open, right? And that heresies try and close the mystery every single time. That's what they try. Jesus is just man. He's just God, right? And so, like, it seems to me that the church's responsibility here should be, yes, everyone deserves to be treated with justice, but equality does not equal sameness. And then, of course, the task of the church and everyone in her is to try and figure out, well, what does it mean, right? But that's also true of, like, for example, Christology. Like, what does it mean that Jesus is both God and man, right? But the thing that we have to do is keep the mystery open.
I really like that heresies close the mystery. Really beautiful. So I want to kind of lean into what Tim Gordon gets right and what these guys get right. And I think it's really important what they get right, actually. Obviously, it goes without saying that they're rejecting and kind of having a backlash against kind of, pure egalitarianism, 50-50, housework, the idea that men can be mothers, this kind of stuff. And so, but there's other things, like when I listen to him, which I've done quite a bit recently, there's other things I really agree with him on, like the idea, that men sometimes have of like, he calls it like the happy wife, happy life kind of mentality of husbands who like see their role as like one of provision and they're secondary to their wives. And so they leave like everything else to them. And then they go play golf or whatever. And like the home and children and everything that goes on in the domestic sphere is the woman's sphere. And that's it, right? And so, he's also, along the same lines, kind of rightly appalled by women then who boss their husbands around or complain about them or belittle them or undermine them and then wonder why they leave to go play golf. And so I think both of these are really like dysfunctions in our society right now. And so I think it's, really true and good that in the Christian understanding that these guys see fatherhood and kind of leadership in the home for men as really paramount, and that they want to like call men to that. They want men to be fully engaged in the home as fathers and as husbands, and they really want to lead in the home. I remember when I was coming out of like secular feminism and I was going to study Catholic theology, and I asked a guy, I was like, well, what do you think about, like, this idea of Ephesians 5, like women, wives submit to your husbands, all that stuff. And he's like, if God didn't tell men to lead, literally they'd be on the couch with a beer and a remote control. And that was like, oh, yeah, okay, that, all right. I mean, I don't, like, my dad wasn't like that. My dad is like a real leader. So I, had whatever. But I think we see that kind of disengagement in our culture among men who are like, this is, like, Ephesians 5 is good news for women, right? Like, I love that my husband is deeply, deeply invested in our home. And so, and this is what we want, right, as men and fathers, to see the good of their families as their goods and want to kind of contribute and provide for the common good of the whole, which is how I see kind of what it looks like kind of as men being the head, which is what Ephesians 5 is asking. And I want to quote St. Augustine again, because I think he really got this, and he said this really beautifully and got Ephesians 5 right. And so he's talking about, and this is in his political writings, and he's talking about, like, domestic kind of, peace and kind of concord. And he's saying, that those who are given kind of authority in the home, right, the ones who are given kind of the task, he said they're to care for the others, that their authority is given not only for responsibility, but for care, and that's the kind of language he uses. So when he talks about that obedience, which of course means to listen, right, to heed, to hear, that the woman is asked to do, then that the children are asked to do their parents. He says, in the house of the just man, however, who lives by faith, and who is still a pilgrim on the way to that heavenly city, even those who command are the servants of those whom they seem to command. For it is not out of any desire for mastery that they command, rather they do so from a dutiful concern for others, not out of pride in ruling, but because they love mercy. And this, of course, we see all through the scriptures of Jesus saying to us, like, when you lead, you are to serve. Obviously the washing of the feet and all that. So I think there is, like, that inclination to get men really much more involved in the family, and I say amen to that, but let's try to do it in a way that's not, like, obliterating wives.
Yeah, it strikes me that one of the distortions that seem to connect a lot of these ideas is a kind of misunderstanding of equality and hierarchy. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we should think about equality and hierarchy, if it's not helpful to think about equality as sameness or hierarchy as a kind of domination. I think our tradition of, has a high view of both of those things and doesn't necessarily see them as in tension, whereas I think our kind of modern Western liberal culture sees those things as very much mutually exclusive. So I wonder if you have, how should we think about hierarchy and equality?
Because I'm borrowing from something Erika just said, so I have to get in before you say it again. I think, the question is always about hierarchy as being ordered to some particular good that's served by that hierarchy. So I love the quote you highlighted that, when someone is leading, as Christians, we always understand them as being a steward of what God has made and what God has ordered it to. So if you have hierarchy, it's because hierarchy serves that good well. And I think where we go astray is where there's just a question of hierarchy as reflecting worth, which is not what hierarchy is for. Hierarchy is about serving the good that's connecting all those people and putting a parent over a child for the good of the child, that is putting a teacher over a student for that reason, that is putting a conference organizer over the panelists because of the different responsibilities she has undertaken, right? And that hierarchies can shift by context because they're about what good they're ordered towards. And I think when you have that, then a lot of these questions of kind of rank ordering by capacity fade away. Because the thing I really want to highlight in that question, I'm both glad that we've developed doctrine and our understanding of biology to understand the capacity for intellect of women, but I'm also always cautious that we're not kind of getting there going like, and therefore women can be just as smart as men, and since the most smart people are the most worthwhile people, like, we have solved it. because I just want to highlight the particular saint who I love, and sneaking her in here, Saint Agatha Kim Agi, who's a Korean martyr. And I know Meg Hunter-Kilmer is on this campus, and so I learned about her from her. Some of you already have. But she was a woman who had an intellectual disability, and her community wouldn't baptize her because she couldn't learn the creed or the prayers. And she said, I just know Jesus and Mary, and that was kind of the most she could offer. And she certainly wouldn't offer evidence against Tim Gordon or Aquinas in terms of her intellectual capacity. But when her community was taken in by the authorities, she was the one who was bravest in imprisonment, and when asked to deny Christ, by her captors, said, well, I only know Jesus and Mary. And she gave courage to the people who were, without a doubt, smarter than she was or had a stronger intellect. And they baptized her in prison, and she died along with them and gave them courage to die. So again, I think that question of hierarchy, would St. Agatha Kim Agi be the person you put in charge of the school? No. Does that imply anything about her ordering in God's kingdom? Also no. A hierarchy serves the purpose for which it's organized. It doesn't reflect the worth of the people.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo just the idea of authority too is always from above. We don't give ourselves our own authority. It's always from above and for the sake of those below, which I think is really important. And then I would also, I'm just going to literally give the mic over to Angela, who's an expert on the Trinity, because I think it's odd that these guys and that people don't understand the idea of hierarchy and equality, because that's the Trinity. And so I just want to, can I give you over the mic? Because she's literally teaches this all the time. And I think obviously there's a complexity. It's the analogy of the Trinity, doesn't that clarify everything? Yeah. But of course the Trinity is a great mystery, but I think it does help us to see that equal in dignity, and yet the Father is, Spirit of the Son.
Awesome. Okay. Well, so I'm weepy from what Leah just said, which was really beautiful. So I mean, one of the things that I have to help my students understand when I teach the Trinity is that so the Father is the origin. He has nobody generates, he proceeds from nobody. He's the origin within the Trinity. And the earliest, one of the earliest Trinitarian heresies was subordinationism, that argued that the other persons had to be subordinate to the Father because he's their origin, and so that implies a superiority. And so they kind of ranked the Trinity based on sort of who is at the top in this kind of superiority. But in fact, what you have in the Trinity is order and equality. And so that was what the church had to come to in talking about all of the persons of the Trinity, that they all have the language that I used of essential equality really comes directly from the 4th century Trinitarian debates, where they had to figure out that the essence of the Son and the Spirit, as well as the Father, was all the divine essence. And so they're all of one nature. So that's their equality, but yet there's this order. So in that sense, the Father is, kind of scare quotes first. Scare quotes because there's no time in the Trinity. So it's not a before and after thing, but the Father is the ultimate origin. But his origin is giving everything to the other persons of the Trinity. So he's this origin who is also perfect self-gift. And so, yeah, that's a different understanding compared to this kind of very rigid hierarchy that you're talking about, where it's being first means superiority, means having power over people who are inferior because they require it because they're so deficient. So I'll stop there. So I don't teach a whole semester right now. So.
I also think, we need to think about being creatures more often too. And the reason that I say that is, Thomas, who, took his lumps from Erika today. But Thomas says in his treatise on creation that the reason for multiplicity and also diversity. So multiplicity is the fact that there's more than one tree, right? And diversity is the fact that there's a bunch of different things, right? There are both trees and badgers, and is because no single creature can reflect God's goodness perfectly. This is the reason for the diversity of creation, which means that yes, there's hierarchy. No one would, actually, I've had students deny that, humans are at the top of the hierarchy, but we work it out in class. But like, you know, no sane person would deny that the humans are at the top of the hierarchy. But then I also have to like recognize that like the fruit fly like can image something about God that I cannot actually, right? And if we kind of keep that bigger context or vision of reality in mind, I think hierarchy makes a lot more sense, right? Because we're each being given to image something that the other cannot, and that doesn't. The fact that I have more capacity and therefore perhaps I'm higher up in the hierarchy doesn't mean that I then like subsume everything beneath me. It's that I'm supposed to steward it, actually. And that's what authority and hierarchy is actually for. But I think we often miss this larger creational context that would be really helpful to keep in mind during these conversations.
All right, thank you. I'd like to open it up to see if there are any questions from you all about any of these topics, or perhaps any other heresies that haven't been discussed. There are so many.
Can I go?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Thank you all so much. This has been really, really intriguing. I have a question, I think, in particular for Rachel. So I'm also a theology student, and a lot of times when I tell people that, and they're like, "You're Catholic?" And I go, "Yeah." And they're like, "So what are you going to do with that?" Because, you can't be a priest. And so in a lot of these conversations on why the Catholic Church doesn't permit women to be ordained priests, one of the aspects that's come up, and I'm not really sure how to respond to this, is that some reasons why people argue that women should have that position is not necessarily because it makes them, view as more equal, but more from almost an administrative role. So there have been plenty of abuses within the church, and at the end of the day, bishops and men only are the ones making the final decision. And when there's been especially abuses amongst women or women religious, and of course women could do this too, but a lot of it's covered up by men kind of protecting each other. And so I've gotten the argument, it's like, well, if women had more of a say or of a role, there'd be more accountability there. And I know Pope Francis has done some things where, he invited women, and they have, I guess, more representation at the Vatican now. But I guess, how would you respond to that? Because I just have not been very sure, because I also can understand where they're coming from. And then secondly, what are your thoughts on the permanent diaconate? I know that has been kind of a talk where movements even within the church are trying to promote that conversation of women in the diaconate because of St. Phoebe, and that the permanent diaconate, I guess I recently learned, wasn't even restored for 500 years after Trent, or I think so, until Vatican II. And so I guess overall is how are we to respond to those objections? Because I do think they come from a good place, but I'm not really sure what to say.
Yeah, you're probably nicer than me. I don't think they come from a good place. So first of all, I think that in a lot of these conversations, there's this idea that somehow original sin didn't affect women. It only affected men, which is like crazy. So yes, it manifests differently in the sexes, right? But this idea that women would somehow not take advantage of power is, just name Hillary Clinton or something. But no, I really am serious though, right? I think that, I'm to be clear, I'm not arguing that women shouldn't be in politics, but we have enough women in politics who have their own issues and start wars unnecessarily. That this idea that women would somehow be immune from power,
right.
The abuses of power is, I think, a little bit crazy. So I think the administrative role argument is a little bit silly. And I do think that, and this is why I started the way I did. I don't think it's actually coming from a good place. I think that it's coming, whether or not the person knows it, from this idea that again, a kind of clericalist idea and a kind of misogynist idea that like I have to be able to do X, Y, or Z in order to be equal in dignity to you. Even if the person might not know that that's the argument that he or she is making, right. But that is at the root of it. So that's just the first thing I would say. And then, yeah, I mean, I haven't looked into the permanent diaconate thing, mostly because I think it's a horrible idea. So I probably shouldn't have said that.
Can you say why, though?
Because, I mean, the deacons are ordained, right? And so I don't think that, and again, like, I think it's clear that the Lord didn't have that role for us in mind for a lot of reasons. But, and I mean, there is something, I think, important about bodiliness in being a symbol. And so, like, even as far the deacon who is not, ordained as a priest is, but he's still ordained, right? He is a symbol of Christ. He's, I mean, he's not in persona Christi in the same way as Christ is, but to go away from that, I think, is to go away from the meaningfulness of embodiment.
I'll take a stab at that too. Yeah, so thank you for that question. I mean, one of the things to think about on the diaconate question, which I'm not an expert on by any means, but the question is really when did we begin to ordain deacons? Right. And that's, from my understanding, that's not yet been resolved historically. Like, when did the diaconate become an ordained issue, an ordained office? And I mean, the one thing that we don't consider is that, if we really are serious about going back to diaconal ordination as it was in the early times, I mean, in the early times, once you are ordained, like this was the case, for example, for married priests, once you were ordained, the expectation was that you were continent for the rest of your marriage. And I hear nobody talking about that, right? It's like, okay, if you want a female diaconate, you are also proposing permanent continence for everybody, including the men who are ordained right now. Like there's, in other words, like, are we completely binding ourselves to these old traditions or not, right? Like, at the moment, the diaconate is already like looking different from how it would have been in the earliest years.
Oh. Have a theologian.
To say that there were women deacons in the early church, but they were not ordained.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the women that are making this case may or may not realize that, but what they're saying, let's reestablish this, but what they're asking for is to reestablish something that doesn't involve ordination. And so in a certain way, you could maybe do that, but that's not what they want.
Right. Right. So, do you want to repeat?
Yeah, so just super quickly, so Deborah's argument is that
Deborah Savage, theologian, who will be speaking.
Yeah, so okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. Deborah is relating to us. That so Phoebe, for example, is in Paul's letter referred to as a deacon, but that was not an ordained reality. And so when people want to return to the female diaconate, they're probably actually want an ordained reality, which is different from what Phoebe was.
Can I say one more thing?
It wouldn't be consistent with the history of the church.
Yeah.
At all.
Okay. It would not be consistent with the history of the church at all. I'm just relaying what you said. But I would like to say one more thing about it. I think historical context also matters, right? And so the situation that we're in today with regard to sexual difference, I think something like even a non-ordained deacons, it would just cause so much confusion, which is why I think it's also such a bad idea. Sex roles were probably a lot more clear in Paul's time. So, yeah.
Can I also just, since we're putting aside their ordination point, I think you also asked about kind of roles for women in the church generally. And I think it's really important to talk about sort of, and there may be advisors in here, we'll be hearing about Helen Alvarez's story on Friday about like the amazing amount of sort of work she's done advising bishops, so many different people in there. I don't know if Pia's here, but anyway, and actually, others who have really been in advisory positions of priests, bishops, and I think that's really important in terms of like being theologians. If you read Marianne Glendon's book, In the Court of Three Popes, she talks about advising 3 different popes. And I think all of that is really an important advance that is different from the idea that I was saying that women can't teach, right? Because they're clearly teaching in terms of whatever their particular expertise is.
All right, thank you.
Hi. Hello. Sorry. I have 3 comments. They might turn into questions if you want.
Hold on a second. Just because there's a lot of people who want to
Yes,
ask, can we just do a question?
Yeah, it's basically kind of one thing.
Okay.
I'm going to try. So,
I'm at the top of the hierarchy.
with regard to hierarchies, I just want to, this has been an issue for all of my life. When I was in high school in 1973, we were talking about these same things. And a lot of what I'm hearing here today is identical to what the conversation was back then. And it just strikes me that after all these years, we still haven't resolved the question. And this was from a Protestant tradition, not from a Catholic one, but the context is the same. Having said that, with respect to heresies, maybe you could tell me whether I'm right or wrong on this, but in my view, Christian belief and theology especially is based on paradox. Anytime you see a paradox, you're encountering the possibility of a true thing. And what heresies are an attempt to resolve the paradox by getting rid of one side or the other. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I would attack, that would be a question.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think this really speaks to the comment about heresy as trying to oversimplify something that is hard, and speaks to your question about why do we keep turning this over? And it's almost, why haven't we settled the question of gender? Why haven't we settled the question of justice? And once you frame it that way, it's because this question of how to deal justly with the particular person in front of us, is always a large question. The attempt to simplify it to an answer that will stand forever for all people is like that question, tiptoeing towards that heresy of making the questions and responsibilities God has put in front of us small and impersonal. And I expect, although I always hope for kind of progress in justice for each other, that within marriage, within society, because men and women have this challenge, this cruciform challenge of equality and difference, we'll keep struggling with it, including because it involves how do I love this particular person in front of me aright? And because it's relational, it will never be closed.
So just before I sit down, one last thing.
I think in the question of justice and particularity, because I can see how many people are behind you,
so
I think we're going to move on to the next person.
C.S. Lewis's
I think we're
essay,
going to move on to the next
Priestesses
person, but I'd love to chat with you over the break.
Okay.
Hi, thanks so much. I'll try to make this quick. So my question is particularly just going back to Ephesians 5 and hierarchy in practice, because I understand, and it makes sense given the fall, that men often, especially without the stronger biological tie that women have to the family, you could argue, I understand that, often we need to call men to a greater investment and contribution in the family that they would naturally do, but that seems to be different to me than headship or, what people say, having the final say. And it seems to give men more moral responsibility. And then in practice, in our post-fall world, it just gives men an opportunity to exercise dominion unchecked because he has the final say. And so it seems like we can couch it in these terms that are all beautiful and symbolic, and no, it's actually, even though it's not the same, it is the same. But to me, it doesn't quite make sense why, pure marriages, for instance, where there is what Pope John Paul II said, contention, where it's not just, all right, well, we can talk about this, but ultimately husband has final say, when husband and wife both respect each other's opinions equally and don't just, default, essentially. Those are statistically shown to be, and it makes sense, the most happy and successful marriages. So that's kind of my question. And also just as an aside, it seems like if we're going to insist on a hierarchy in marriage, even though, again, pure marriage kind of seems to be the way, it seems like it should be more whoever has a better capacity to lead. Like you said, we're not going to put, as amazing as a person is, if they are intellectually challenged, we're not going to put them as the head of a school. And in many relationships, when it comes to different decisions, maybe the wife in some cases, she's wiser on this issue. She has more knowledge. So if there's going to be any hierarchy at all, which again, I'd like to ask why there does have to be, why would we just automatically delegate it to someone based on their sex?
I'm going to leave the theology to everyone to my right, but I want to speak just personally to what headship means in my marriage as a practical matter, because it's not primarily who has the final say. And if it were, I don't think we'd experience it very deeply, because my husband and I don't disagree very much. So like if in some way his ability to be my husband well depended on overruling me, we would seldom experience it. We're often in amity. Where our headship is most strongly expressed practically in my marriage is that he leads all family prayers. And it's not based on capacity. We didn't do that based on who is better at leading. It's because he's my husband. And I think part of it is about what we each give our children. Our children know very deeply how much they've received from me. One of them is still nursing, one of them stopped not so very long ago. And we want in our house, the love we bear them to be very strongly articulated, and both from the tradition of the church and in our discernment for our own marriage. That's why my husband leads all family prayers. So there are things they receive distinctively from each of us as a gift and love, and not based on which of us is better at them.
That's great, Leah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's putting words into the tradition's mouth to say headship means the man gets the final say. Like that is definitely out there. People say it. I think C.S. Lewis says it at one point. God bless him. But like, I don't think. Yeah, and he was not a contentious kind of person, from what I can tell in his
Catholic
marriage.
either.
He wasn't Catholic also, yeah, correct, yeah, in case people didn't know that, yeah.
It's easy to forget.
Yeah, but, so I don't think that that's a very helpful way, because as Leah's pointing out, it's assuming a paradigm of disagreement, which will happen in marriages, but it's like, well, this only rides into the rescue when there's disagreement, whereas I think it is more a matter of channeling the male's general capacity and interest in like leadership and thinking big picture and like thinking kind of like beyond the horizon of what's in front of you, which is, the kind of thing. So I have a son who's on the spectrum. It's like male intelligence can tend toward the spectrum where you get like really focused on one thing. There's a lot more male prodigies who are good at one thing as opposed to female prodigies who tend to be good at lots of things. It's forcing that or asking for that kind of focus and leadership to be turned into the household, because it's so easy instead to turn it outside of the household. And so I think that is precisely why Paul is asking women to say, you need to sometimes step back and not just like take charge of everything in the house because you know it and it's comfortable to you, and it's like, no, I'll just change your diaper and like whatever, and like, freeze the guy out. But the man has to be like, whoa, hello here. Like this is life right here, right now around this dinner table. And like, I need your focus and leadership to come here right now. So that's my take.
I also think I don't think the Catholic understanding of headship, especially in more recent magisterial teaching, means that the man has the final say, or even that the man is in a position of power vis-a-vis the woman. I think the metaphor in Ephesians 5 is doing a lot of different things. One of the things it's doing is stressing union. The head-body metaphor is also a metaphor of union, of unity and interdependence. Also, I think headship signifies more being a source or a font of generosity, almost like the Father in the relationship of the Trinity, rather than a ruling over. So I think it's kind of a misunderstanding, misapplication of headship as a kind of power relationship. And what is explicitly current magisterial teaching in the church, or just magisterial teaching full stop, is that passage should be interpreted in terms of mutual subjection in Christ. So any understanding of headship has to fall from that principle. So I would just sort of stress those things. In fact, I was like looking around because I'm like, where's a crucifix? Because I just want to like point at a crucifix and say like, that is headship. Like that's the male role in marriage, right? That's what Ephesians 5 says, is to outdo your spouse in self-gift, to initiate the dynamic of self-gift. It's not about having the final say in a particular argument. So I actually think, rightly understood, headship is actually a really rich concept, but we have kind of reduced it to a sense of power that I think is a misreading.
Can I just recommend, just because I go sort of through the intellectual history and why Hobbes ruined all of this for all of us, on a podcast with Lila Rose where we talk a lot about this. And then the other thing I would do is just recommend to you this really, I think, really good book by a woman who's a JP2 scholar who talks about the husband as a giver-in-chief and the wife as entrusting herself because of, well, obviously, for me, 7 children, like entrusting my vulnerability and dependency to this man, right? I mean, so we want him to like guard, right, over kind of the common good, as I said, to free me to kind of take care of the parts. And that's obviously kind of sort of more legal and common good language, but I think that's helpful because the woman tends to, because we're person-oriented, be sort of focused on individual and concrete needs of each, and that those individual needs of each shouldn't kind of take over the common good of the whole. And I think that's an important thing. This book is called, it's Mary Stanford, and it's called The Obedience Paradox. And I think it's really helpful. Again, the reason why Hobbes ruins it all is because obedere is to listen, to heed, to hear the word obedience, but Hobbes, I mean, disconnects it all and makes it into sort of slavish rule and power. And so we have a hard time hearing anything about like authority, obedience, any of that without power being the central thing. And that's just not, again, Hannah Arendt on authority is really, really good, distinguishing kind of authority from power and even persuasion. There's a lot of like intellectual history that really muddies this for us. So anyway, I would just recommend
Could you repeat the book name again?
Yeah, it's called The Obedience Paradox. It's very slender, and she's a mom of many and has, it's a very wise book that I would recommend.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry? Oh, the podcast is the Lila Rose podcast. I was on it. So Lila Rose, Lila, probably people know who she is. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. I've come across a lot of women who've gone to the Vatican to advocate for women's ordination, and I've noticed a trend that it's usually women who struggle with same-sex attraction or are in LGBTQ activism already. And when they convert or change their minds about women's ordination, it's usually because they came across theology of the body. So my guess is that the root of the problem of women's ordination is this hatred of sexual difference. So my question for you all is, how do we promote the beauty of sexual difference to combat the push for women's ordination?
Yeah, sure. This is your domain. Go
I think number one is teaching women about their bodies. It is astonishing to me how little we understand our own bodies and how like kind of amazing they are, and like the order and the, you know, the design. I don't like to use the word design because I worry about intelligent design people, but it is I really do. The Aristotelianism that Angela mentioned in her talk this morning, and Erika also referred to, I think actually continues to this day in a lot of ways, that like women are sort of just this like passive receptacle in childbearing, right? People don't understand like how conception actually works, and if they did, I think that a lot more women would be much more inspired by their own bodies. But I think that the way that we teach biology now is that women are men with inconvenient body parts, and that's going to necessarily lead to kind of a self-hatred of your own body and wanting to be a man.
And I just want to say one thing about the partial good faith of people pursuing women's ordination, which is, I come from a different generation from my mother, and there were many more careers open to me and many more open to her than to her mother. My grandmother went to law school, like, Erika, but couldn't get hired, right? And I think there's a real reason that people have looked at history and said almost everything we said women couldn't do as a vocation turned out to be wrong. And so my base assumption is that this is wrong too. And I think that's a real zeal for justice for women that does happen to be wrong in this case, but I don't blame people for thinking I'm going to follow the rule of where I see women excluded, I see an injustice and see what I can do. I think it really starts from pursuing a deep understanding of what the priesthood is, that you uncover that. And again, if people are drawn to the priesthood because it's power, then they'd make bad priests whatever their sex is, aside from anything else. If they're drawn to the priesthood because of a zeal for justice for women and because of a real awe at the Eucharist, then the question is, where should that awe for the Eucharist be directed? But that's something I would want to celebrate and strengthen, just point towards Christ and where he is asking to meet it.
And I think all this has been wonderful, but just if you do, or if you're really, really interested, any of you in the priesthood, I just want to recommend another book, which is Sister Sarah Butler, Women and the Catholic Priesthood, who was an advocate for women in the priesthood, and then her bishop asked her to do all sorts of studies and try to kind of strongman the church's position, and she came around to understanding it. So I would just recommend that book or her chapter in a book, Women, Sex, and the Church, that I edited several years ago that has kind of an account of all the reasons why all these teachings are pro-woman, and she does the priesthood chapter, and Angela does the contraception chapter.
Sarah Butler.
Sister Sarah Butler.
Sister
Brilliant,
Sarah Butler.
brilliant theologian.
All right, we have time for one
Okay.
more question.
All right. So my question is, to what extent has the development of doctrine about women been intertwined with the development of our understanding of the laity? And how do you see those two things could continue to move forward together?
Yeah, this is just, I'd have to think more about this, so this is just my initial thoughts. It's definitely, so I was rereading in Mulier's, I was just rereading Mulier's Dignitatem to prepare for this talk, and John Paul II quotes from the Vatican II document on the laity quite a bit, and so I do think that it plays a role, definitely. The insight that is expressed so clearly in those documents is that is basically like the anti-clerical insight that Rachel was summarizing, right? That it is, so that's dependent upon the universal call to holiness, that the excellent Christian is the saint, right? And so the church declared in Trent, and it's still true, that there's an objective ranking of the states of life, but as John Paul II says in the Theology of the Body, and it's like Christine de Pizan, really, that the most excellent Christian person is the one who excels in love. And so it doesn't matter what your state of life is, it matters the degree. And of course, the different states of life are designed to foster love, right? But that's really the measure. So I think that has really helped the development of doctrine. But we would also have to take into account what the church has taught through the centuries on women religious, which I'm not an expert on, but John Paul II did write a document on the consecrated life, Vita Consecrata, I believe, that reflects many of the things that he says in Theology of the Body, emphasizing like the spousal gift of religious life and what that looks like for women in particular.
All right, well, we've come to the end of our time, so thank you so much for your attention. We'll have a half-hour break. Hold on, I got to look at my cheat sheet here that I don't have a good brain for details, so I'm like, what do I have to tell you right now? Brr. Okay, there's snacks outside. We'll come back here at 3:30 for our next talk. And also, by the way, when you registered, if you signed up for one of our evening events, like either the kind of digital Cosmos show about Hildegard or the Visio Divina, you have tickets in your name tag to those events. You also have tickets to the dessert and drink social in your name badges, so just don't lose those. And we chose very Lenten desserts, so don't feel guilty about partaking in those. Okay, thank you all. See you back here in half an hour.